want to convince a group of people that everything about them is negative, what you have to do is tell them where they're from is a negative place. And this is what they've done to black people. They say, black people, you're negative, you're bad, because Africa is negative and Africa is bad. So the images that we have of Africa, we always see the underbelly. We always see the propaganda. We always see the warfare, but they never show the other side.
One of the things that I've discovered about conquered people is that most conquered people have had their ancestral memory erased. And they only know what missionaries or enslavers have taught them. And usually it's negative.
There is good, there is bad, there is advancement, and there is a lack of advancement in all cultures. The problem is that this society tends to want to show you the extended belly of a baby in Ethiopia. It wants to show you the negativity of Africa.
People think Africa and Asia and Guatemala, Southern America, these places were all jungle. Jungle came after the invasions of European colonialism. Then the jungles came in because nobody was manning the land anymore.
Look at the map. Just this map tells you alone that the great majority of Africa is grassland. It shows you right here. It's grassland, no jungle. In fact, the Everglades, by proportion, there's more jungle in the Everglades than there is proportionately in Africa, and that's in Florida.
There's more jungle in Europe and in Asia than there is in Africa. Without a doubt, Africa has its wetlands, it has its greenery, some of the most beautiful animal kingdoms in the world. But most of Africa is not jungle. There's more jungle on the other continents than there is in Africa. In fact, you have vast greenlands in Africa, miles, tens of thousands of miles of nothing but flat, beautiful green land.
Whenever they show images of Africa, they like to show the hunter-gatherers, the bushmen, the brothers running around half-naked with sticks. And that really represents about 1% of the whole population of Africa. As a matter of fact, you have those same hunter-gatherer people up in Europe. There's a group of people called the Sami people who live just like that, who live in mud huts, and they live that hunter-gatherer experience. But you never see any kind of mention of them in the media. You only see the African Bushmen, but you never see the rest of the whole continent and see how people are really living over there. Whenever you look at old Tarzan movies or old cartoons from back in the 1920s and 30s, they would always show the cannibalistic African person dancing around in the jungle with a big pot, putting in missionaries, cooking them and eating them. And that's a major myth about Africa because there's no evidence of any kind of cannibalism going on in Africa.
There is no evidence of cannibalism in Africa. In fact, if you read a book called Man-Eater, there's more references to Europeans eating each other in the cold than there is Africans eating each other in the warmth. Why are you going to have a need to eat each other when the Creator and the Son has given you mango and peanuts and food to eat that comes to you plentifully? There's no evidence of it, but again, to denigrate Africa and Africans, they have to create an image that people are going to shy away from.
There's so many fallacies about African people and African history and culture, and cannibalism is one example. You know, based on my study, I found more evidence of cannibalism practiced among Europeans in Virginia in the 1600s. There are documented cases of the first settlers coming to Virginia from England, coming here in fall and in the dead of winter and not having enough supplies to see them through that season. So there's documented instances of people exhuming the bodies of the dead and eating them. There's one particular instance, I forget the gentleman's name, but actually I read this in the National Geographic magazine about a man whose wife died and he kept her death a secret so that he could eat her corpse and survive the winter.
the cannibalism was going on in Europe big time. There's a lot of evidence showing the cannibalism that was going on in Europe. As a matter of fact, this whole vampire phenomenon that we have is rooted in the cannibalism that was going on in Europe in the Middle Ages. One of the most famous vampires, Dracula, Count Dracula, is really based on a real person named Vlad Dracula, who's also known as Vlad the Impaler. And there's a very famous portrait of Vlad the Impaler from around 1499, sometime in the 1400s, showing him and these people that he impaled on the stake. But they only show half of this portrait, because when you pan out of this portrait, you will see Vlad the Impaler literally at a dinner table eating the body parts. And I mean, he has like knife, fork, salt and pepper, like he's at Applebee's or Denny's or something.
You have to remember, at the time, Isabella, or the queen at the time, put a bounty on slaves. And part of the edict that she sent out was anyone or any of the people that you catch who are cannibals, you can enslave them. So now everybody would say, okay, they were cannibals.
Another myth about Africa is that it's extremely violent. Whenever we see anything about Africa, especially movies and the news, we always see the African warlord. We always see the African rebels riding on trucks, the African rebels with rocket launchers and machine guns. So what they do, the Western media, they'll take footage of a war-torn area. And the footage might even be old. They'll get old footage and show war-torn areas of Africa. They did that with the Coney 2012 propaganda not too long ago. And they'll try to pretend that this is what all of Africa is like. But in reality, out of the top 10 countries around the world with the lowest violent crime rates, 6 of those countries are in Africa, like Senegal, Cameroon, Mali. A lot of people don't know that. In an attempt for Western powers and European historians to distance Africa from Egypt, because they try to pretend that Egypt and the rest of Africa is totally different. So what they did, they created something called the Sub-Saharan African, meaning that the Africans below the Sahara Desert were somehow disconnected from the Africans in the north. Africans have always interacted with each other all over Africa. Africans have always moved around Africa. Even the Sahara Desert, it was not always a desert, number one. Number two, the Nile River goes from North Africa right into Southern Africa. So if they wanted to go back and forth from North Africa to Southern Africa, they can just take the Nile River.
Now, one of the things we have to be concerned about is the concerted effort to take Egypt out of Africa. And so many times when people speak of Africa, they exclude Egypt. And I think, and many people I think would agree with me, many of my colleagues and contemporaries, they would say that excluding Egypt from Africa would be like taking Greece and Rome out of Europe. It's just a huge void.
The more south you go, the more African-centered you'll get. As you move more north, their attachment to those structures are just not there. There's a lot of reasons why that happens, just in terms of they know it's not them. They know it's not their mindset. They know that they want to exploit it, but they do not know it. It is not part of them. They are an invading force. For them to be in Egypt today is equivalent to Europeans claiming America of 3,000 years ago.
And they could care less about those temples because, number one, they didn't build them. And from an Islamic perspective, they really wouldn't like to see them in existence. The reason they're there is because they are a moneymaker for the Egyptian government. Let's be clear.
A lot of the Egyptians that are there in Egypt now, they're invaders. They came later on down the line. They're not the ancient Egyptians. They're not connected to the ancient Egyptians, and they know that. When they're over there, they don't respect the ancient monuments as their own. Like when you go to the mosque over there, they respect the mosque. They're not over there smoking cigarettes. They're not selling things in front of the mosque. But when you go to the pyramids and you go to the museums, you go to the Sphinx, people, they're out there hustling. They're out there trying to sell you things. They're smoking cigarettes. They're out there running scams. They're running game on you.
Right. Can you see this picture? We know this picture?
Yes, well, let me see that. What was that? Hold on.
Mr. Obama.
That's Barack Obama?
Obama was my father.
Barack Obama was your father?
Yeah, in the Panorama Place. And then maybe later.
When
white scientists go into the temples of Kemet to excavate and clean up the walls and temples and make them visitable and inhabitable, they are changing the color of the actual paintings of the Africans on the wall. There was an entire report that came out how the scientific excavators in the temples of Kemet were lightening up the images on the wall, the metal nature. So you have black images, and they're using chemicals that actually turn the black image tan.
Professor Smalls told me when he went to study over there, he said the reason why we over here in the West are so caught up with ancient Kemet is because the seeds of Kemet, after Kemet was destroyed, all were driven to the south and to the west of Africa. And during the time of the slave trade, the strangers were the ones that they gave up first. So the people who actually are the ones that were brought over here were the remnants from ancient Kemet. They too, the people of Mali and the people of these areas that you're seeing with the Dogon, they say that the Dogons themselves are the forgotten parts of those tribes that actually ended up or who were driven out of ancient Kemet.
The Dogon were a group of Africans from the West Coast who had in fact been able to achieve a degree of astrological superiority and dominance that we really don't see a contemporary for or precedent for other than what was achieved in Nile Valley civilization.
And people began to chase the Dogon to examine them because you couldn't figure out how these so-called primitive Africans would have knowledge of astronomy, particularly the white dwarf star Sirius B, that Western astronomy itself is only coming to grips with. And so the Dogon have developed a kind of, I almost said infamy in the world. In fact, there's even a book called The Sirius Mystery, and it's about how the Dogon, these primitive Africans, could have knowledge of a star system that's invisible to the naked eye. So the Dogon are black people in Mali with an astronomical lore.
Whenever we see people in Africa, we always see the AIDS-infested African babies, the African people. But what they do not talk about is the AIDS that's going on in Europe. Most people don't know that most of the new AIDS cases today are not in Africa. Most of the new AIDS cases today are coming out of Eastern Europe, out of Russia, the Ukraine, and there's an AIDS epidemic over there in that area, but you never hear about it in the media.
Nations are invaded at the end of their power. If you look at all of the great nations that rose, when nations are invaded, the nation itself is sick already. Only dying nations are invaded. Nations act like animals to each other. If the state is strong, which means it is in a constant state of war, it is continuously fending off what it doesn't want. Not we're always shooting and killing. Commerce wars, trade wars, competitions, even sports. The state is always in a constant push off, and let in. We want this acquisition. We want that. We gonna take that. Give and take. When another state starts to get weak because its people are unskilled, becomes ignorant, betray the king or queen or the ruling class, or the ruling class becomes tyrant, and the people can't control the people anymore. And it is things. You lose your resources. Just your state starts to deteriorate. The minute your state starts to deteriorate, other states are looking at you. It ain't got nothing to do with we love you, we knew you, we know your family. As a matter of fact, we'll take you in. You go into exile and come on into our state. And come on in, but we taking your land, your resources. Why? Because you weak.
How can Africa be so poor and yet be materially so rich? It's real simple. The answer lies in the structural adjustment programs, SAP, the structural adjustment programs that are imposed on African nations by the International Monetary Fund of Washington, D.C., the World Bank, of Washington, D.C., and USAID. These three organizations come into Africa, loan money, and then charge an interest rate on that money that they know the African nations can never pay back, thusly re-enslaving the entire nation and, in fact, the entire continent.
I point out that when Spanish, English, Dutch explorers would go through, let's say, the Americas, there's a good example here for the African continent. Many of the places they arrived at were already abandoned. Our tribes leaders, our kings and queens, our priests traveled the world. They were literate. They read and spoke many languages. They heard and knew. These guys are coming to take over the land. They got weird weapons, and this is what they're gonna do. They went back to their tribe, told everybody, gather up your stuff. We have to leave. There is an invading force coming. We have to go. So many tribes were warned. When this invading force came, many times they came and found the place deserted and just claimed it as their own.
Why was Muammar Gaddafi killed? Muammar Gaddafi was murdered because he, along with the other African heads of state, were about to bring into existence Africa's first central bank. They were erecting a central bank in Africa, which was going to do what? Back its money to the resources under the ground in Africa. Now, what would that have done to the global economic order? Remember, the United States dollar isn't backed on any natural resource. The British pound isn't backed on any natural resource. The Canadian dollar, the European Union, their currency isn't backed on any natural resource because Europe doesn't have a lot of natural resources. Africa does. So if they would have been successful in creating a central bank of Africa, coming up with a unitary currency, and then backing that currency to the material wealth under the soil, they would have bankrupted every other economic system in this world, from America to Europe to China. That was revolution, and that's why Muammar Gaddafi had to be assassinated, because he was about to help the African heads of state eliminate modern slavery and neocolonialism from the continent.